That's all right. Can you unmute?
Sorry, I've had a combination of technical and domestic crises that delayed my appearance, but a bit like the Russian invasion, although I am here, whereas I don't think the Russian invasion will be. Okay. Oh. So now I've gone. Hello?
You all right? We can see you and hear you.
I can't. Sorry, I hope I didn't use any bad language then, because the screen disappeared. Okay. Sorry about the delay. I think I'll take 25 minutes though to set out the issues involved here. The fundamental thing to understand is that although it's called the Ukraine crisis, it's not really about Ukraine. What we are seeing is a clash between two sets of imperialist powers. On the one hand, there's the United States, the most powerful, still, despite its decline and so on, the most powerful imperialist power in the world, aligned with, crucially, the leading European imperialist powers and various hangers-on in NATO. That's one side. On the other side, you have a relatively weak imperialism, Russia, although it enjoys a degree of support, limited support, from the US's main rival, which is not Russia. This is one of the peculiar things about this business, but is China. So what we have is an inter-imperialist conflict. So let me just say very briefly what I mean by imperialism. By imperialism, I don't primarily mean a big state dominating smaller countries, dominating its neighbors and so on. That's a form of imperialism that has existed for many centuries, going back to the Roman Empire, the Chinese Empire, the Persian Empire. So going back 2,000 or 3,000 years, let's say. But specifically capitalist imperialism, the kind of imperialism that we know today, involves what I think is best understood as an intersection, a coming together, sometimes a fusion of economic competition on the one hand and geopolitical competition on the other. Economic competition is what drives capitalism. Firms struggling with each other to get as much profit for themselves. This is what underlies the whole process of capital accumulation that provides a system with its dynamic. Geopolitical competition is rivalry between states. It's competition between states. And again, this is something that in one form or other has existed for thousands of years, since the emergence of class societies and states. But what you have at the beginning of the 20th century is the merger, the coming together of geopolitical and economic competition, because states need a strong capitalist industrial base to be able to have the resources and the technologies needed to exert their power globally. And at the same time, capitalist firms are increasingly operating globally and they need the support of their states. And the result of this merger, this intersection of economic and geopolitical competition is imperialism. And it's very important. One of the key points, I'm restating what you find in the classical Marxist critique of imperialism by people like Rosa Luxemburg and Lenin and so on. It's very important to understand imperialism is a system. It's not just one big power dominating others. It's not reducible, as some of the left like to do, to the US, even though the US is the biggest imperialist power in the world. It's a system of domination. The imperialist powers jointly dominate the rest of the world. There are a handful of them, probably about 6, I would say, something like that. But at the same time, those states compete with each other. And that's what we're seeing today. Okay, now, although Ukraine is the staging ground of this conflict, the important thing to understand is the conflict itself. But at the same time, I need to say something about Ukraine itself. Putin, the Russian president, is right. He wrote this long essay about the relationship between Russia and Ukraine. He's right that historically there are very strong political and cultural links between what we now call Russia and Ukraine. But what we've so there are those kinds of links, but it's a part of a much more complicated history in which, at least for the past few centuries, the area that is now Ukraine, I put it like that because Ukraine, the current borders of Ukraine are very new. They date back to the Second World War. But what is now, the territory that is now Ukraine has been pulled, again, both politically and culturally, between Western Europe on the one hand, the so-called advanced European powers like Britain and France, and so on and so forth. Germany in its time, Austria, important for the case of Ukraine, and on the other hand, Russia as a powerful and expanding imperialist state until roughly the time when Ukraine in its present form was constituted. And that means, and so for quite a long time, much of Ukraine was partitioned between, on the one hand, the Russian Empire, and on the other hand, the Austrian Empire. And the result of these kinds of pulls means that Ukraine is quite a diverse place. It's so that Western Ukraine tends to look towards Europe, and a lot of the population are Catholic. Eastern Ukraine, partly for economic reasons, to do with the way in which its industries were integrated in first the Russian imperial economy and then the Stalinist economy in the era of the Soviet Union, tends to look towards Russia and Orthodox Christianity, which prevails in Russia and is very important ideologically for Putin, is a big influence in Eastern Ukraine. It's a place that has suffered terribly in the 20th century. It was a battleground during the First World War. It was fought over by both the counter-revolutionary forces that sought to overthrow the Bolshevik Revolution and the Bolsheviks themselves during the Civil War after the Russian Revolution of 1917. The collectivization of agriculture, the forced collectivization of agriculture under Stalin in the 30s had terrible effects in Ukraine. There was a famine in which millions of people died. And then when Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, sent German armies to invade the Soviet Union in June 1941, Ukraine was again the battleground, and initially at least, and was the site of many Nazi atrocities like the massacre of Jews at Babi Yar near Kiev. Those experiences have helped to forge, those experiences of outside domination and suffering have helped to forge a Ukrainian national consciousness, which came into its own when the Stalinist regime, the state capitalist regime in the Soviet Union, went into crisis in the 1980s. So you get the strong assertion of Ukrainian nationalism. And it is in fact the Ukrainian parliament in 1991 that initiates the collapse of the Soviet Union by voting for independence. But the period since independence has not been a happy one for Ukraine. It's been essentially dominated by rival gangs of oligarchs who fought against each other, competed for domination, producing a couple of what are called revolutions, but I think they were pretty much pseudo-revolutions, really, not genuine transformations driven by any sort of mass democratic impulse, or only quite weak democratic impulses, and tilting westwards and eastwards, depending on circumstances, vacillating in particular between the European Union and Russia. Now, in 2014, without going into the details, Ukraine, with the second of these so-called revolutions, Ukraine tilted strongly westwards. And Putin, the Russian president, reacted to this by seizing Crimea. The Crimean Peninsula is important strategically for Russia because it's the base of the Russian Baltic Fleet. It's crucial to its ability to be the dominant power in the Black Sea. And in addition to that, with a pro-Western government installed, or a succession of them installed in Kiev, in the Ukrainian capital, Putin backed separatist republics in southeastern Ukraine, two of them, and there's been kind of low-level counterinsurgency going on there. So that's some of the background to where Ukraine fits into the picture. Now, let's look at Russia. Russia is no longer the superpower that at least had the ambition of matching the US that it was during the Cold War between 1945 and 1991. Its economy is about the size of Italy these days. I mean, the Italian economy is quite big and important, but it's clearly not in the same league as the US or China. Nevertheless, Putin has been able to construct a stable regime by imposing order on Russia's oligarchs, because just as in Ukraine, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Russian economy was privatized and dominated, still is really dominated, by a gang of predatory oligarchs who got the assets of the old state economy cheap and became obscenely wealthy as a result of that. But Putin imposed order on these oligarchs, so that this is a regime that, while it's organized on perfectly neoliberal lines in terms of its economic policies, but nevertheless where private business is under the control of the state, and to a significant extent of Putin personally. Internationally, Putin made use of what are Russia's main assets. The first is that Russia is one of the most important producers and exporters of oil and natural gas in the world. In particular, Europe, including Britain, but also the European Union, is heavily dependent for its energy on Russia, and Putin has been playing games about that recently. Secondly, he's sought to build up Russia's military power, or to some extent to rebuild it. Russia is still the second greatest thermonuclear power in the world. It has far more missiles and so on than China. And I think he's probably technologically ahead of China still in the military area, although maybe that's changing. Putin has also modernized the Russian army to make it a much more effective and professional fighting force, and he's exploited the weaknesses of Western imperialism to give himself and Russia more influence globally. So, for example, he intervened in the civil war in Syria to rescue the regime of Bashar al-Assad. He's also, Russian forces have also been involved in Libya, where there's a long-standing and awful civil war raging. And now there's an increasing Russian presence in sub-Saharan Africa. France, for example, which dominated large parts of northern and western Africa, which had been its colonies in the past, is being squeezed out to a significant extent by Russian influence, including Russian mercenary companies. There's an organization called the Wagner Group, which supplies mercenaries to governments all over Africa, and lots of people think it's really controlled by the Russian Foreign Intelligence Service. So here we have a weakened imperialism that is still trying to make the best use of what it has in order to increase its influence. What has precipitated the present crisis is Putin's preoccupation with the expansion of NATO. When the Cold War came to an end, the last Soviet leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, agreed when Germany reunified that it could join NATO. In exchange, the US Secretary of State, Jim Baker, promised that NATO would not move eastwards. That promise was broken by subsequent administrations. So we've had the expansion of NATO and the EU into not simply the former Stalinist states in Eastern and Central Europe, but also former Soviet republics in the Baltic. And what Putin is worried is that he will be encircled by NATO. And in particular, he sought to block either Ukraine or Georgia, two states that strategically border on Russia, from joining NATO. He fought a war with Georgia in 2008 to stop that happening. He intervened in Ukraine in 2014, again with that objective. And I think the military buildup isn't about seizing or occupying Ukraine. I mean, that would be a crazy thing to do. Putin used to work for the KGB, the old Soviet intelligence service, and he knows what it did to Russia to try to occupy Afghanistan in the 1980s. If he'd forgotten, he could look at what happened to the US and Britain when they occupied not just Afghanistan, but Iraq after 9/11. So I don't believe he wants to seize Ukraine. I may be proved wrong by all these experts and so on. In the end, all the Western experts may be proved right and Russia may invade Ukraine. But I think the military buildup is designed to squeeze as many concessions from Western governments as he can, and in particular, if he can, to get a promise from from Biden, from the US president, that Ukraine will not join NATO. He's also worried about greater NATO activity in the Black Sea. The response from the US, but egged on by Britain, although in a completely incompetent way. I mean, it was spectacular when Liz Truss, the British Foreign Secretary, told the Russian Foreign Minister that she wanted Russian troops to withdraw. So he listed where they were. I mean, he was trapping her, but it worked. And said, do you mean they should withdraw from these places, Rostov-on-Don and places like that? And she said, yes, absolutely. And the British ambassador whispered to her, these places are in Russia, which shows just how incompetent the present British government is. How can you demand that Russia withdraws troops from its own territory? In any case, the US response has been to talk up the danger of war and to refuse to concede on the question of Ukrainian membership of NATO. Now, there's double talk here because, in fact, I don't think Ukraine would be allowed to join NATO. Quite simply because if Russia did invade Ukraine after that, it would lead to a world war, because NATO powers are committed to defend each other from external attack. So I don't think Ukraine would be allowed to join NATO. The Ukrainian president said the other day it was a dream, implying it would never happen. But they don't want to admit that. And I think what the US game, what Washington's game, is to make Putin seem weak if he doesn't invade. You know, to say he's the Grand Old Duke of York. Oh, shouldn't really mention him. You know, he marched his men up the hill, and now he's marching them down again. But of course, the danger with that kind of game is it might encourage Putin to attack, precisely not to lose face. So what we have is a kind of game of chicken going on between the two sides, which is obscene. You know, you have these kind of mind games being waged by great powers when huge numbers of people's lives depend on it. But this is what they do. What we don't know is what's going on in secret. You see, when I was a boy, there was the Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962, which is generally described as the point at which the world was closest to a nuclear war. Now, I was reading about a new book on the crisis, which said that the US President Kennedy and the Soviet leader Khrushchev had worked out a deal very early on, under which the Russians would withdraw the nuclear missiles they placed in Cuba, and the Americans would promise not to attack Cuba and would withdraw some missiles that they had close to Soviet territory in Turkey. They had this worked out, but they didn't want to announce it, or Kennedy didn't want to announce it too quickly, because he wanted to do well in the congressional elections that were about to take place by looking tough. So, you know, they're always, it's not just the kind of mind games that the two sides play with each other, but it's also the deals that they construct. And we don't know about this. But I think it looks like the person who's going to come out of this as a winner is Putin, because he's forced a series of promises, short of Ukraine not joining NATO, out of the West, and he's got attention and lots of negotiations, and people like Scholz, the German Chancellor, going to Moscow and things like that. He's also had the explicit support of China, Xi Jinping, for his position about Ukraine not joining NATO, which is quite important, and it's a shift. It reflects the fact that usually China stays out of international crises. This time, they have played a role. That's important for Putin. He's much more powerful, aligned with China than he is on his own. And he's also been able to split, well, it's not very hard to split NATO, because France and Germany have been much more wary about this confrontation for a variety of different reasons, including their dependence on Russian gas. Nevertheless, you know, we'll see how things work out, but this fundamentally is, as I try to say, an inter-imperialist conflict. Working class people around the world have no interest in the victory of either side. They're both greedy, predatory, and violent states competing with each other. The way in which it's begun to feed into the rivalry between the US and China is particularly dangerous, because this is the big inter-imperialist rivalry. The rivalry between the US, the old imperialist power, and China, which is now the biggest manufacturing and exporting economy in the world. And it can make crises harder to resolve and make them more dangerous when local regional conflicts like this become drawn into that larger conflict. So it's very important for socialists to take a principled anti-imperialist position. This is the opposite, of course, of what Keir Starmer has done. He's pledged his eternal loyalty to NATO and Western imperialism in a way that is just pathetic and laughable, attacking the Stop the War coalition, which has immense moral authority for its role in opposing the war on terror, on which it was completely vindicated. So, as so often, Starmer tells you what not to do. Our watchword has to be what Luxembourg's comrade Karl Liebknecht said during the First World War: the main enemy is at home. We stand against our ruling class, which is, and in particular the Johnson government, which is egging on the conflict because obviously to try and distract attention from Johnson's own problems. So this is the kind of position that we need to take, and it vindicates the importance of revolutionary socialist politics, because there are not many places where you're going to get this kind of analysis, which identifies the roots of the conflict in the imperialist system that we need to help develop movements of the working class around the world to get rid of. I'll leave it there.
Thanks very much, Alex. Perfectly on time as well. Well done. Okay, comrades, we're now going to open up the floor. If you would like to speak, please raise your virtual hand and I will call people in. We probably have time for about 25 minutes of discussion. So it'd be good people can raise, comments, or they can raise questions. It would be good to get a bit of a discussion going. So
yeah, I'm just going to go through the questions as quickly as possible. Thanks for all the interesting points that have been made. First, Ben made an important point about energy policy. Why haven't the countries that are dependent upon Russian gas, in particular in Europe, why haven't they speeded up a shift to renewables? The simple answer is because they're deeply embedded in the dominant system of fossil capitalism. And this has been reinforced by the kind of neoliberal economic policies that have been implemented in recent decades. So both Britain and the EU have an energy policy that has become increasingly reliant on buying gas on what's called the spot market, which is the daily market for oil and gas. This is the kind of what buttresses the energy supply system in Europe. And hey presto, in the last 6 to 9 months, gas prices have shot up, and this is now, and the effect of those increases is now working their way through everywhere, hitting people's living standards, because of the way in which European decision makers decided to rely on natural gas and to rely on the market for the supply of natural gas. I mean, this just underlines the urgency of switching to an economy that is based on renewables. But that itself means confronting fossil capitalism, means confronting the existing system. Oksana raised an important question about China's place in all this. You see, I think when Biden and Xi, the Chinese president, say Ukraine, they actually mean Taiwan. Because one of the biggest points of conflict or potential conflict between China and the US is Taiwan, which is a part of China that was annexed by the Japanese and which since the victory of the Chinese Revolution in 1949 has been controlled. First, essentially, it was, without going into the history, which Lawrence knows better than me, has been controlled by forces hostile to the government in Beijing. It's very important for the Chinese government, and Xi in particular, that sooner or later they take Taiwan back, although they emphasize the importance of negotiating and so on. But there's greater friction over it now. There are all sorts of Chinese military exercises near the island. Biden has said that the US would come to Taiwan's defense if if China tried to take it back by force, and so on and so forth. So I think Biden thinks if he lets Putin take Ukraine, which I don't think Putin wants to do, but that's another matter, then Xi will think, now I can take Taiwan. And the same in reverse as far as Xi is concerned. So this is an illustration of what I was saying about how the regional conflict in the former Soviet Union has become subsumed under the growing rivalry between the US and China. And that, to hop over to Noel's question, is where the danger of nuclear war arises. I don't believe anyone is going to do anything that will start a nuclear war over Ukraine. Famous last words. Well, they may be last words. But I think that there is a danger of because the conflicts between the US and China are now so deep-seated, of the rivalry between Washington and Beijing slipping out of control and developing into a nuclear war, which of course would get rid of us quicker than climate change would. So, and this is why the way in which this conflict has been drawn into the rivalry between the US and China is so dangerous. Steve asked several questions. I think that the humiliation of the US humiliation when the Taliban took Kabul in August was the beginning of Biden's fall in the opinion polls. So this is an additional motive for Biden to hang tough over Ukraine. But again, as I said, when I was talking about the Cuban Missile Crisis, you have to take everything with a slight pinch of salt, because this may all be being done for show. Russian troops helped to repress the protests in Kazakhstan, but I don't think it makes a material difference. It's had what's happened there. I don't think it's had any effect on the Ukraine crisis. If Russia is a rival when it comes to Kazakhstan, it's China. Russia and China are getting together despite the competition between them in Central Asia. Several people were fairly rude about the role of Britain as a military factor in this. I think it's true. I don't think, I mean, the British Army, as someone said, is now tiny. I think it's the smallest it's been probably since Henry VIII or something like that. It's very small, and it was badly defeated in both Afghanistan and Iraq. I mean, more humiliatingly defeated than the American forces were, where it had to be rescued in both Iraq and Afghanistan by the US Marines. So I think for Biden, the role of British military involvement is more symbolic than anyone else. The advantage of the Brits is that they're for reasons of saving Johnson's neck, they're enthusiastic about being involved in propping up Ukraine, whereas the Germans in particular are very, very wary about it. I think it's a mistake, therefore, to say that Britain doesn't count to anything like that. Britain is still quite a significant military power. And there was a very interesting episode last year when the new aircraft carrier, the Queen Elizabeth II, led a kind of task force which involved American participation that sailed from Britain, spent some time in the Mediterranean, sent a destroyer into the Black Sea, I think mainly to antagonize the Russians, which it succeeded in doing, and then steamed to the Pacific and into the South China Sea, which China claims as its own. So I think Britain has been involved in the pact of the US with the US and Australia, whereby Britain and the US will help Australia build nuclear submarines, which are to use potentially against China. So you can't dismiss Britain's significance. It's not just a joke, however much, of course, one wants to laugh at Johnson. I don't know that much about cooperation between Russia and Ukraine. It's clear that Nord Stream 2, the big pipeline project involving especially Russia and Germany, is, from Putin's point of view, crucially about bypassing Ukraine, because previously in conflicts in Russia and Ukraine, sometimes the Ukrainians have disrupted the flow of energy westwards and so on. So that suggests to me that cooperation between Russia and Ukraine is declining, which is absurd because an awful lot of Ukrainians speak Russian as their first language. There are all sorts of links between the two countries. There's a great deal of shared history. So it's absurd and tragic that the two countries should be potentially at war. But this is a symptom of just how absurd and tragic the system in which we live is. The fact that we can have this kind of danger of war appearing, not exactly out of nowhere, but very, very rapidly, and really dragging everything else into it so that there's barely any oxygen left for anything else, is an indication of how dangerous the world is. And it's dangerous, crucially, because we live under a capitalist imperialist system. There's a link between the failure to switch to renewable energy and the kind of conflict that we're seeing now. And the only way out of it is to get rid of this system, is to have a socialist revolution. As Lenin and Luxemburg said, the time of the First World War, to have an international socialist revolution to rid the world of imperialism and create the basis for a very different way of living. And that's really what we in the Socialist Workers' Party are fighting to do. So if you agree with what we've said tonight, please join us and help us change the world. Thanks very much.